long before the first light of the sun touched Middle-earth, in the quiet darkness beside the silver waters of Cuiviénen, a mystery unfolded, one that would shape the fate of all elves. Picture this, a lone figure in the soft glow of candlelight, Elrond half-elven, his fingers brushing against ancient scrolls that hum with forgotten stories. These fragile pages hold whispers from the dawn of time, secrets of the first elves who awoke beneath the stars, their voices singing into existence, a legacy of splintered tribes, noble kings, and hidden strife. And tonight, we journey with him as he unravels these tales, stories of kinships broken, of clans divided by oceans and destiny. Some truths have been buried for ages. But the past has a way of stirring, like wind through autumn leaves. So tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? And as the night deepens, what hour has found you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to wander these ancient paths together, because the story of the elves isn't just a chronicle of Middle-earth. It's a mirror reflecting how legends begin, how bloodlines fracture, and how even the wisest among them carry memories heavy as stone. The first whispers of life stirred beneath the vast, star-strewn sky of Cuiviénen, where the waters shimmered like scattered silver. Here, in the hush of an untouched world, the Quendi opened their eyes for the very first time, not to sunlight, but to the cool glow of distant constellations. Their voices, hesitant at first, soon wove together in a melody so pure, it seemed to hum through the very earth beneath them. This was no ordinary song. It was the first music of the elves, a language of wonder and awakening. But even as their harmonies rose into the night, unseen ears listened from across the seas. The Valor, guardians of the world, heard their voices and marveled, how could such beauty exist beyond the light of the trees? So began the great journey, an invitation etched in starlight and hope. Yet not all hearts were swayed. Some hesitated, their feet rooted to the shores they had always known. What lay beyond the horizon, and who were these radiant beings who called them westward? Leaders emerged in Gwe, fair and resolute, Finwe, bold with curiosity, Elwe, steadfast yet torn. Each faced a choice, to lead their people into the unknown or linger beneath familiar skies. The division ran deep, a quiet fissure that would one day shape kingdoms, wars, and legends. As the first groups turned toward the beckoning light, shadows stirred among those who remained. Whispers coiled like mist through the trees, of a voice not of the Valor, deep and honeyed, promising power to those who stayed behind. The elves did not yet know it, but their songs had awakened more than just wonder. They had stirred the attention of something far older and far darker. The great journey unfolded not as one harmonious march, but as a slow unraveling threads of starlight, splitting into three distinct strands. At the front strode the Vanyar, golden-haired and eager, their eyes fixed on the distant glow of Valinor with unshaken faith. Close behind came the Noldor, their hands restless for creation, already whispering of gems and metals waiting to be shaped by their skill. Then there were the Teleri, lingering like the tide at the shore, their hearts torn between the promise ahead and the familiar melodies of the world behind them. It was Elwe who held them back, his steps slowing as if pulled by some unseen force, until one evening, beneath twilight-hushed trees, he simply vanished. The forest swallowed him whole, leaving his people stranded between two worlds. Some waited for moons uncounted, singing sorrow into the wind, Others pressed onward, crossing the sea under new leaders, their harps singing of lost kin. But those who stayed became shadows themselves, drifting through the dense woods of Beleriand until their songs grew faint as mist. And all the while, a presence stirred in the darkness, patient, calculating. It watched the fractured tribes with cold interest, sensing the cracks in their unity like fissures in thin ice. For where division takes root, doubt follows. And doubt is a weapon sharper than any blade. In the radiant peace of Valinor, where the light of the two trees bathed all in gold and silver, the Noldor reached the zenith of their craft. None shone brighter than Feanor, whose hands shaped wonders beyond imagining. Chief among them, the Silmarils. These three jewels captured the very essence of the tree's light, their glow humming with a life of their own. Even the Valor marveled at their perfection, but where the gods saw beauty, Morgoth saw only something to covet, to claim. His whispers slithered through the shining halls, sowing discord like a poison in the soil. When the darkening came, when the trees were slain and Valinor plunged into shadow, the Silmarils became more than jewels. They were the last embers of a lost light, clutched desperately by Finwë, Feanor's father, as he stood alone in defiance. His blood stained the marble floors that night, his silence a louder cry than any oath. Feanor's rage was a wildfire, consuming all reason. Before the assembled Noldor, he swore his terrible vow, to pursue Morgoth to the ends of the earth, to slay any who withheld the Silmarils from him, kin or stranger alike. His sons echoed the oath, their blades gleaming in the torchlight. The air itself seemed to shudder at their words, as if Mandos himself leaned closer from the shadows to whisper his doom. Not all were swayed. Galadriel, her hair catching what little light remained, stood apart, her thoughts a tempest. She had dreamed of Middle-earth's wide forests, yes, but also of blood soaking its rivers. To go was to defy the Valor, to stay was to abandon her people. Her choice would ripple across ages yet unborn, and so the Noldor turned their backs on paradise. Their armor gleamed dully under clouded skies as they marched toward the icy hell of the Helcaraxë, where grinding flows promised suffering beyond measure. Behind them, the sea roared with the grief of the Teleri, whose ships they had taken by force. Ahead, Middle-earth lay waiting, a land already whispering of their coming. In Doriath, Thingol's court buzzed with rumors of a host approaching, their banners torn by wind and wrath. Melian the Maya, her eyes dark with foresight, tightened her grip on her daughter's shoulder. The Noldor brought not just vengeance, but a shadow that would cling to their names for millennia. For oaths sworn in fire are not easily undone, and doom, once spoken, cannot be outrun. The shores of Alqualondë had always been a haven of music, where the Teleri's pearlescent ships rocked gently in the harbor, their sails catching the last amber light of the fallen trees. But on this night, the air rang not with harps, but with the clash of steel and the screams of the betrayed. Feanor's demand was simple, the ships or blood. The Teleri, their hands still stained with the salt of the sea, they loved, refused. How could they surrender what had taken lifetimes to craft? Yet desperation had sharpened the Noldor's hearts into blades. What began as shouts curdled into violence, brother against brother, until the waves lapped crimson at the docks. The Valor's judgment came swift as a storm. The very waters recoiled, casting the stolen ships onto hidden rocks, while a shadow of doom settled over the Noldor like a shroud. Even the stars seemed to turn away. Yet Feanor pressed on, his gaze fixed eastward, leaving half his people stranded on the bleak shores. Among them stood Fingolfin, his hands trembling not with fear, but fury. To turn back now would mean humiliation. To press forward meant crossing the grinding ice of the Helcaraxe, where winds flayed flesh from bone. His people looked to him, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Was loyalty worth such suffering, or was this the moment to break from Feanor's madness? Meanwhile, far beneath the earth, a spider stirred in her webs. Ungoliant's hunger had been sated for now, but the echoes of kinslaying reached even her dark lair, and she coiled tighter, sensing the unraveling of the elves' unity. For every oath sworn in fire, there is a counterweight of grief, and as the Noldor stumbled forward, some toward ice, others toward flame, the weight of their choices pressed heavier than any crown. The Helcaraxe waited, its frozen maw gaping wide. Those who dared its path would find no songs to guide them, only the keening of the wind and the ghosts of their own regrets. Step by agonizing step, the ice would test not just their bodies, but the very bonds that once made them one people. And somewhere ahead, beyond the jagged horizon, Middle-earth held its breath, for the coming of the Noldor would split its history into before and after. While the Noldor bled upon the ice and fire of their exodus, another kingdom had risen in the heart of Beleriand, one woven not from vengeance, but from enchantment. Under the ancient oaks of Doriath, where sunlight filtered like liquid gold through the leaves, Elu Thingol and Melian, the mayor, ruled a realm untouched by war. Here, the Sindar thrived in a sanctuary unlike any other, shielded by the girdle of Melian, a living barrier spun from her divine will. No enemy could breach its shimmering veil. Even the very paths shifted beneath trespassers' feet, guiding them in circles until they collapsed in exhaustion. For centuries, this magic held firm, allowing the gray elves to cultivate arts of song and starlight, their harps echoing through halls carved into the very roots of the forest. But whispers have a way of slipping through even the strongest defenses. News of Alqualondë's horror drifted into Doriath on the breath of frightened travelers, their cloaks still damp with seawater and grief. Thingol's face darkened as the tales unfolded, kinslaying kin, the innocent cut down upon their own shores. His hand tightened around his sword's hilt, the metal cold against his palm. From that moment, the Noldor were no longer wayward cousins in his eyes, but murderers cloaked in stolen glory. He forbade their tongue to be spoken within his borders, a decree that hung heavy in the air like the scent of coming rain. Yet in the quiet of night, his daughter Luthien would trace the star's reflection in the palace pools, her voice humming melodies older than the girdle itself. The world beyond called to her, a mystery wrapped in moonlight and danger. Meanwhile, the winds carried more than just echoes of past violence. Beyond Doriath's borders, new shapes moved through the darkness, figures cloaked in gray, their eyes sharp with purpose. Some sought refuge, others bore secrets that could unravel even the most carefully guarded peace. And deep in the north, where shadows pooled thickest, Morgoth's gaze turned southward, his fingers drumming impatiently upon his throne. Every kingdom has its weakness. For Doriath, it was not its walls that would falter, but the hearts within them. For how long can a realm endure when its very protectors begin to dream of what lies beyond? The girdle trembled then, not with strain, but with something far subtler, the first ripple of a fate no magic could deflect. Some say Melian felt it that night, her hands pausing mid-weave as she stared into the endless dark beyond Minigroth's caves. A song was coming, and it would break more than silence. The fires of war erupted across Beleriand as the Noldor raised their banners against Morgoth, their swords glinting with the same fury that had carried them across the Helcaraxa. Angban's black gates trembled under the force of their assault, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed the Dark Lord might fall. Lands long shadowed by his dominion bloomed anew. Hithlum became a stronghold under Fingolfin's steadfast rule, while the highlands of Dorthonion echoed with the laughter of freed folk. Yet victory, like a mirage, shimmered just out of reach. Old wounds festered beneath the surface. The Sindar, ever wary, remembered the blood spilled at Alqualondë, and their distrust hung thick as fog in the passes of Erd-Wethrin. When Caranthir's hot temper insulted Thingol's kin, the fragile alliance between the two peoples frayed like a rope stretched too thin. Then came Fingon, golden-haired and reckless, riding alone into the jaws of Thangorodrim. High on the cliffs where eagles dared not soar, he found Medros Feanor's eldest son, chained to the rock, his body broken but his spirit unyielding. A single arrow cut the bonds, a gesture so daring it silenced even the whispers of the oath. For a breath, the feud between their houses seemed to dissolve like mist in dawn's light. Yet redemption is never so simple. Medros, though freed, carried chains of another kind, the weight of his father's vow, its words seared into his bones. He pledged friendship to Fingon's people, but his brother's eyes burned with a different fire. Honor and madness waged war behind his gaze, each battle leaving him more hollow than the last. Morgoth, watching from his obsidian throne, fed on their divisions like a crow on carrion. While the elves bickered, his creatures multiplied, orcs blackening the plains, dragons stirring in their pits. Every skirmish, every bitter word among his enemies was a thread pulled from the tapestry of their resistance. And yet, on the eve of despair, a figure emerged from the wilds. A lone messenger, his cloak ragged from travel, brought tidings that slipped through the war camps like a secret. Far to the south, in the forests of Osiriand, a new light flickered. The Edain, they called themselves men, mortal and brave, who had crossed the mountains seeking refuge. Some scoffed, but others, like Finrod, caught the scent of hope on the wind. Perhaps not all allies needed to be born beneath the stars. Perhaps the tide could still turn. The messenger's words hung in the air, fragile as a spider's silk. Morgoth's laugh echoed from the north, but in the shadows of Doriath, Melian's fingers stilled over her loom. She sensed it then, the faintest tremor in the song, a note not yet sung. The War of the Jewels had only just begun. High above the encircling mountains, where eagles nested among the peaks, Gondolin stood like a dream wrought in marble and gold, hidden, untouchable, or so its king believed. For centuries, Turgon had ruled this secret kingdom, its white towers untouched by the wars that ravaged Beleriand below. Its gates remained shut, its people safe behind walls stronger than steel. Yet no veil, however cunningly woven, can hide a city forever. The whispers began as murmurs in the market square, a servant glimpsing a shadow where none should be, a sentry vanishing without trace. Morgoth's patience had finally borne fruit. His spies, cloaked in guile and false faces, had slipped through the defenses, their reports feeding his hunger like kindling to a waiting flame. The attack came at dawn, not with stealth, but with fire and thunder. Balrogs, their whips carving molten scars into the sky, led the charge as dragons scaled the mountains, their bellies swollen with ruin. The streets of Gondolin, once ringing with harp song, now echoed with screams and the clash of steel. Turgon, his crown gleaming amid the smoke, stood tall upon his palace steps, his voice rallying the last of his guard. But even the mightiest king could not stem this tide. With every fallen warrior, the city's light dimmed, its glory crumbling to ash. Amid the chaos, Chuar and Idril moved like shadows, gathering the wounded and the frightened. Their hands, stained with soot and blood, clasped tighter as they herded survivors through secret tunnels, carved years before Idril's foresight, now their only salvation. At her side, young Arundel clutched a tattered banner, his eyes wide not with fear, but a terrible understanding. This child of two worlds, his father's mortal courage and his mother's ancient grace, would carry more than memories from this night. The weight of choice already settled upon his small shoulders, though he could not yet name it. As Gondolin burned behind them, the refugees stumbled into the wilds, their path lit only by the dying embers of their home. Behind, the dragon's roars shook the earth. Ahead lay only darkness and the rumor of the sea. But in Idril's pack, wrapped in silk as fragile as hope itself, lay a single treasure salvaged from the wreckage, a map, its edges singed, marking a way none had dared take. The sundering seas stretched vast and merciless, but what choice remained when the land itself had become a pyre? Some say Arundel, turning for one last look, saw not just smoke, but a single star piercing the gloom, as if the heavens themselves were whispering of paths yet untraveled. The survivors' footsteps faded into the night, their fate a question written in wind and wave. Far to the west, the sea's salt spray awaited, and with it, the thin, desperate thread of a prophecy not yet fulfilled. For even as Gondolin fell, its story refused to end. It simply changed hands, passing from king to child, from ruin to voyage, from fire to the faint, far glimmer of a ship's lantern on the horizon. The sea had never known a voyager like Arundel. With the last light of Gondolin's fall still smoldering at his back, he set his course westward, steering Vingalot through waters no mortal ship had dared to cross. The Silmaril bound to his brow pulsed like a captured star, its glow cutting through the mist that clung to the edges of the world. For months, the waves tested him, hurling storms against the hull, whispering temptations to turn back. But his wife Elwing's words anchored him. The Valor alone can break Morgoth's grip. Be our voice where we cannot tread. When the shores of Valinor at last rose from the foam, even the air seemed to hold its breath. The Valor, long withdrawn from Middle-earth strife, listened as Arundil's plea unraveled the ages of suffering. The kinslayings, the shattered oaths, the kingdoms swallowed by shadow. His voice, raw with grief and hope, did not speak for vengeance, but for mercy, and in that moment, the very fabric of fate shuddered. The host of the West assembled, their armor brighter than the sunken trees, their resolve echoing in the thunder of marching feet. The war of wrath had begun. Back in Middle-earth, the land itself seemed to sense the turning tide. Rivers ran red with the ashes of battle, as Morgoth's legions clashed against the Valor's might. Mountains crumbled like sand beneath the fury of the winged dragons, while the sea reared up in great waves, swallowing entire plains. Amid the chaos, the elves faced a choice: stand together or be swept away. Gil-galad, his spear aloft, rallied the scattered Noldor and Sindar alike, their old grievances crumbling under the weight of survival. Even Círdan's shipwrights, their hands more accustomed to timber than swords, joined the fray, their voices rising in a hymn of last defiance. Yet it was in the quiet of a makeshift camp that the war's true legacy took shape. There, Elrond and Elrose, the half-elven twins orphaned by the conflict, stood at the crossroads of destiny. Elrose, his heart pulled by the mortality of his human lineage, chose the path of kingship, his name destined to echo in the annals of Numenor. Elrond, though just as torn, felt the hum of something older in his blood, the patience of the Eldar, the weight of memory. His hands would one day heal rather than rule, preserving lore where his brother forged empires. When the dust of Angban's collapse finally settled, Middle-earth lay forever altered. The sea had devoured Beleriand whole, leaving only fractured islands and whispered legends. But from the wreckage, new seeds took root. Lindon's green shores became a refuge, its havens bustling with elves who had seen too much to ever again take peace for granted. And high above, Arundel's ship gleamed in the twilight, no longer a desperate plea, but a beacon. The age of the Eldar's dominion was waning, yet their light lingered, caught between the fading stars and the dawning dreams of men. The wind carried the scent of salt and scorched earth, but also something softer. The first blooms on the slopes of the Erd Luin, stubborn and bright. After fire, after flood, life, always life. Amid the smoke and ruin of the War of Wrath, a quiet valley nestled between the misty mountains and the Bruinen River remained untouched. A place where waterfalls sang over smooth stones, and the air hummed with an almost forgotten peace. It was here that Elrond, his hands still trembling from the weight of lost kin and fractured kingdoms, chose to build not a fortress, but a sanctuary. Imladris, the elves would later name it, Rivendell in the tongues of men. Its halls welcomed the weary, whether Noldor nobles with grief etched into their brows, or Sindar wanderers still flinching at the sound of drawn steel. The very walls seemed to breathe with healing, their arches woven with melodies older than the strife outside. Yet history seldom allows for rest. Word came from Lindon, carried by Gil-galad's swiftest riders. Sauron, Morgoth's most cunning servant, had not perished with his master. Instead, he coiled around the lands of Mordor like a serpent, his shadow stretching ever longer. The High King's call to arms split the peace of the valley like thunder. For the first time in centuries, Noldor and Sindar stood shoulder to shoulder, not as allies of convenience, but as kin bound by shared dread. But the parchment in Gil-galad's grip held another name, one that made even Elrond's breath catch: Elendil of Numenor. Mortal, fallible, and yet the last hope of a world trembling on the brink. Old grudges flared in whispered councils. Would you have us trust their fleeting lives to guard our future? A Sindar lord hissed, his fingers white around his wine cup. But Gil-galad, his crown heavy with the weight of decision, silenced the murmurs with a single truth. The enemy does not care whose blood stains his claws, only that it flows. The last alliance was forged that night, its oath sealed not in star-lit ceremony, but in the grim understanding that some darknesses demand every hand, mortal or immortal, to hold the line. As armies gathered under banners of silver and crimson, Elrond stood at the valley's edge, watching the first snow dust the peaks. The ring of Barahir, token of his human lineage, burned cold against his chest. In that moment, he was neither holy elf nor man, but something rarer, a bridge between worlds. The road ahead would lead to Dagorlad's blood-soaked plains, to the screams of eagles and the grotesque chorus of orc horns. But it would also lead to a fateful slope where fire and gold would twist history into a snare. For now, Rivendell's candles flickered defiantly in the gathering dark, their light a promise that even as war stained the horizon, there would always be a hearth for the broken to return to. And high above, unseen but felt, the One Ring waited patient, patient on the finger of a king who did not yet know he was already doomed. The Third Age dawned with a hush, as if the very air of Middle-earth had taken a lingering breath before surrender. The once great cities of the Elves now stood half empty, their marble halls echoing with footsteps grown far too rare. The forests, once alive with silver song, whispered now in voices only the oldest trees could understand. Even Rivendell, with its cascading waterfalls and shelves heavy with ancient scrolls, felt the slow creep of time. Elrond's wisdom couldn't halt the inevitable. In Lothlorien, where golden leaves drifted through eternal twilight, Galadriel watched the horizon with eyes that had seen empires rise and crumble like sandcastles. Every evening, the scent of the sea grew sharper, its call humming in her veins like a half-remembered melody. To stay was to cling to a fading dream. To leave was to sever the last thread, binding her to the land she'd shaped for ages beyond counting. Legolas of Mirkwood, young by the measure of his kin, yet old enough to feel the shift in the wind, stood at the edge of his father's realm, fingers brushing the bark of a gnarled oak. "Do you hear it too?" he murmured. The tree, though silent, seemed to sigh in answer. The woods no longer sang as they once had. Shadows coiled where laughter used to dance. His people had become ghosts in their own halls, their bows still keen, but their voices dimmed. When word came of a fellowship forming, one that would carry the fate of Middle-earth into mortal hands, his choice was made in the space of a heartbeat. To walk among men and hobbits, to fight not for dominion, but for the right of dawn to break anew, was perhaps the most elven act left to him. Meanwhile, in the hushed glades of Lothlorien, Galadriel's mirror caught the flicker of futures yet unwritten. The reflection showed not just rings and ruin, but a ship with sails like moth wings, waiting. Celeborn's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing in silent understanding. Some departures are not surrender, but a passing of the torch. The time of the elves was ending, yes, but endings, as the wise know, are simply the moment before something else begins. And so the sea longing swelled, a tide no levee could hold back. For some, it was a whisper, for others, a roar. But in every heart that still beat beneath the stars of Middle-earth, the question lingered. When the final hour came, would they turn toward the horizon, or plant their feet in soil that no longer remembered their names? The wind carried no answer, only the salt tang of waves breaking on shores unseen. The gray havens lay veiled in mist as the last ships of the Eldar prepared to depart, their white sails trembling like the breath of a world, holding back tears. Frodo stood at the quay, his wound from Weathertop aching with the damp, a pain no healer could fully mend. Yet it was not the scar that weighed heaviest, but the lightness in his chest, as if some essential part of him had already crossed the sea. Beside him, Gandalf's staff glowed faintly, its light catching the silver threads in Bilbo's cloak, the old hobbit swaying slightly with the rhythm of the waves. They were the unexpected guests at this farewell, mortals granted passage to a shore no man had walked since Elrose's choice millennia before, but the true heartbreak unfolded silently near the water's edge. Arwen's fingers clutched the Evenstar pendant, its light dimmed now that her choice was irrevocable. Elrond's face, usually a mask of ancient composure, fractured as he pressed his brow to hers. No words passed between them. None could hold the enormity of this parting. To lose a child not to death, but to the slow erosion of time. To know her years would burn bright and swift as a candle, while his own stretched endless and emptier. This was a grief no lore in Rivendell's libraries could soothe. When he finally stepped back, the wind carried the salt of the sea, and something sharper, the scent of Nifredil blossoms, their petals already curling in the autumn chill. A fleeting thing, like the age they were leaving behind. Círdan the shipwright, his beard white as the foam upon the waves, raised his lantern high. The gesture was both benediction and signal. The tide would wait no longer. As the gangplank drew away, Legolas's voice rose in a lament, older than the ruins of Doriath, its notes wrapping around the quiet sobs of Samwise behind them. The music seemed to slow the very turning of the world, if only for a breath. Then the sails caught the wind, and the vessel slipped into the fog like a whisper into silence. Behind them, Middle-earth stretched vast and changed. The kingdoms of men flourished where once elves had danced beneath the stars, their lanterns bright but ephemeral as fireflies. In Rivendell, the chairs in the Hall of Fire would sit emptier each winter, the harps untouched, their songs growing fainter in the memories of those who remained. Yet in the glades of Lothlorien, where golden leaves still drifted without reason or season, the air hummed with a presence not wholly departed. Mortal children would speak of glimpsing figures just beyond the tree line, shadows with eyes like starlight, watching, waiting. The age of elves had ended, but endings, as the wise know, are never quite as absolute as they seem. In the hushed scriptorium of Minas Tirith, where dust motes danced in slants of pale sunlight, a young scribe named Calion brushed his fingers over pages so ancient their edges crumbled like autumn leaves. The tome before him bore no title, only the faint, elegant swirls of Quenya, script words unread for centuries, their ink still shimmering with traces of some long-lost art. He had stumbled upon the text by accident, hidden behind a false panel in the archives, its leather binding warm to the touch, as if humming with latent memory. Here lay accounts of the Eldar that even the lore masters of Gondor had forgotten, songs from Cuiviénen, diagrams of Noldoran smith craft, maps of realms now drowned beneath the sea. His pulse quickened. To share this could illuminate the shadows of history. To hide it might spare the world truths too potent for mortal hands. The debate erupted quietly at first. Fellow scholars gathered by candlelight, their voices hushed but fervent. These are not mere stories, argued Tyrael, her fingers tracing a sketch of Feanor's hammer. They are blueprints. What if we could reforge even a shadow of such light? Opposite her, Captain Borendir folded his arms, his scarred palm resting on the pommel of his sword. And what if others seek that power? The enemy may be gone, but greed never sleeps. The air thickened with the weight of their words, heavy as the scent of crumbling parchment. Calion's dilemma sharpened with each passing day. The more he translated, the clearer it became. This was no dry chronicle. Between the lines pulsed warnings, secrets, perhaps even remedies for sorrows not yet named. That night, as a gale howled against the tower walls, he dreamt of a voice, singing in a tongue he shouldn't know yet understood perfectly, a lament for lost homecomings, for choices that ripple beyond lifetimes. Dawn found him at the window, watching pale light crest the Doriath. There, amidst the wind's whisper, he caught it, a strain of melody so old it predated the mountains themselves. The song of Cuiviénen, carried not on air, but memory. His decision crystallized like frost on glass. He would copy the texts, not for kings or armies, but for the wanderers, the dreamers, those who still looked to the stars and wondered. Let the lore live even if fractured. Let it spark not dominion, but awe. In the end, wasn't that the true legacy of the Eldar? Not their jewels or swords, but the way their stories refused to fade, seeding hope in soil they'd never walk upon. As his quill began its careful work, the wind stirred the pages around him, lifting a single leaf, inscribed with a phrase that glowed faintly. Remember not just what was lost, but what waits to be found. Outside, the first notes of a minstrel's tune rose from the lower city, a child's voice, untrained and bright, singing of elven queens and silver trees. The past had a way of circling back when least expected, deep in the tangled heart of Nan Elmoth, where sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy. Whispers curled between the roots of ancient oaks, whispers of figures glimpsed at dusk, silver-haired and silent as mist. They moved like shadows, these lingering elves, their footprints vanishing before the morning dew could settle. Some said they were the last of the Sindar, those who had refused the call of the sea, choosing instead to weave their exile into the very bark and stone of Middle-earth. Others claimed they were Avari, the unwilling, who had never stirred from their waking place at Cuiviénen, their loyalty to the starlit wilds unbroken by ages. But all agreed on one thing: to find them was to risk far more than a stray arrow in the dark. The rumors drew desperate souls like moths to a guttering flame. A ragged explorer from Gondor, his map smudged with sweat and hope, vanished 3 days east of the forest gate. His journal found later beside a stream, its final entry speaking of music that cut deeper than any blade. A dwarven trader swore he'd seen a city of white spires flicker between the trees at twilight, only for the vision to dissolve when he blinked. Yet the most telling sign lay not in these pursuits, but in what followed. The way the wind would still mid-gust, the way birds fell silent mid-song, as if the forest itself held its breath to keep their secrets. Among those who sought them was Idrun, a wanderer with Noldor blood running thin in her veins. She had grown up on fragments of song, her grandmother's voice, trembling over tales of Doriath's glory, of Melion's vanished girdle. When the rumors reached her, something dormant stirred, not curiosity, but hunger, to stand where her kin still walked, to hear Sundering spoken as it had been before the wars. It was a dream that outshone even the lure of Valinor. But when she finally crossed into their hidden glade, the elves who emerged from the gloom bore no welcome in their eyes. Their blades, though sheathed, hummed with warning. "You tread where none were bid," their leader murmured, his voice soft as a knife sliding from its scabbard. The choice they offered was cruel in its simplicity: leave and seal her lips forever, or stay and never return to the world beyond. Neither path led back to the life she'd known. To speak of this place would bring armies crashing through the undergrowth, hungry for relics and power. Yet to vanish into their ranks would sever her from every soul who had ever loved her. The firelight flickered across their faces, etching lines deeper than time alone could carve. These were not the deathless lords of legend, but survivors weary, fierce, and brittle as frosted leaves. Above them, the stars wheeled cold and bright. They had watched the first elves awaken. They would watch the last fade. Idrun's fingers brushed the hilt of her dagger, not to fight, but to feel the weight of decision in her palm. Some silences are not meant to be broken. Some sanctuaries must remain beyond the reach of maps and memory. And as the wind sighed through the branches, carrying the scent of unseen blooms, she understood the true cost of longing, to love a thing enough to let it stay lost. The woods closed behind her like water over a stone. No trail marked her passage. No song would ever tell of this meeting. Yet high in the canopy, unseen, a single voice began a melody older than the mountains, its notes drifting upward, not in lament, but in gratitude. For now, at least, the twilight would remain theirs. The old mariner's hands trembled on the tiller, as the wind carried voices that shouldn't exist, not here, not now. For 50 summers he'd steered his fishing boat through these same coastal waters. Yet tonight the waves hissed, secrets in a tongue his bones remembered, but his mind could not name. High above, the stars pulsed like distant lighthouses, their light glinting off something just beneath the surface. A flicker of silver, a ripple of song. His granddaughter, Lyra, recoiled when he described it later, her fingers knotting in her shawl. Grandfather, it was only the wind, she insisted, but the salt in his beard told a different story. It had tasted sweeter that night, like nectar from a blossom no mortal hand had ever plucked. By dawn, he'd packed his meager belongings, a wool coat, a flask of fresh water, a compass whose needle now spun uselessly, as if the very poles had shifted. The village whispered of madness, of an aging mind, succumbing to the sea's siren lies. But Lyra, sorting through his abandoned nets, found something that stilled her breath. A single seashell, impossibly warm to the touch, its interior scored with markings too precise to be natural. When held to her ear, it didn't echo with ocean murmurings, but with a chorus of clear, unearthly voices. The same melody her grandfather had hummed brokenly since childhood, though he'd sworn he'd never heard it before that night. The choice coiled around her like a tide. To chase him meant surrendering to a dream that had shattered greater souls than hers. To stay was to let the mystery, and the man who'd raised her, slip forever beyond the horizon. For weeks, she watched the western cliffs, tracing the paths of gulls with restless eyes. Then came the storm, a tempest of such violence it seemed the sky itself was furious, and through its heart, a single shaft of golden light, falling not from the clouds, but from some unseen source beyond them. That was when she understood. The boundary between legend and truth had never been solid, only thin as sea foam, waiting for the right moment to dissolve. Her boat was smaller than her grandfather's, her hands less sure, but as she pushed off from the pier, the shell tucked against her chest, the voices rose to meet her, not in summons, but welcome. Behind her, the village lanterns dwindled to pinpricks, then vanished. Ahead, the waves themselves seemed to part, their crests glowing with submerged radiance. Somewhere in the depths, shadows moved with effortless grace, their forms shimmering between fish and something far older. The sea had always been a road, not a barrier. and for those who dared listen, it still led home. On shore, the fishermen crossed themselves and spoke of drownings. But occasionally, on still evenings when the tide was just right, the wind carried back a strain of music no mortal instrument could replicate, and the shell lyra had left behind pulsed faintly, as if answering a call from beyond the edge of the world. The villagers of Ernthorpe swore the old oak at the forest's edge had eyes not the knots and cracks of ordinary bark, but a watchfulness that lingered long after twilight faded. Children dared each other to touch its trunk, then fled giggling when the leaves shivered without wind. But young Eofor, quieter than the rest, returned day after day, leaving offerings of wild strawberries and polished river stones. For the lady, he told his mother, who dismissed it as fancy, until the morning she found him humming a tune no minstrel had ever taught him, the vowels liquid and strange on his tongue. The loremaster Harthad rode in from Enuminas when word reached him, his saddlebags heavy with crumbling scrolls. He'd spent decades tracking such whispers a harp heard in empty ruins, footprints too light for mortal feet, each account thinner than the last. Kneeling before Eofor, he listened as the boy described silver hair, like moonlight on water, and a voice that made the air taste like spring. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. Tall tales were one thing, details no child could invent were another. That night, Harthad pored over his manuscripts by guttering candlelight. The last confirmed sighting of an elf had been near the ruins of Mithlond, 3 generations past. If this was truth, not fantasy, it meant the age of the Eldar had not yet fully closed its hand. Yet to announce such a discovery would bring treasure hunters and scholars swarming the woods, their clamor scaring away whatever fragile presence remained. His quill hovered over fresh parchment. To record this would preserve it for posterity. To stay silent might spare the last of them the weight of mortal recklessness. Dawn found him at the oak, its roots gnarled like the veins of some slumbering giant. The air hung thick with the scent of malorn blooms impossible here, so far from Lothlorien's golden groves. A single leaf drifted down, catching on his sleeve, its underside traced with glyphs too delicate for human hands. When he turned it toward the light, the markings shimmered briefly, then faded like ink in rain. Eofor was gone when he returned to the village. The boy's mother pressed a scrap of blue fabric into Harthad's hands. Left on his pillow, she whispered, her voice frayed. No tracks led from the window, no branches had cracked underfoot, only the imprint of small bare feet in the moss, ending abruptly as if he'd stepped into the air itself. The loremaster folded the cloth carefully, feeling the weight of his choice settle upon him. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut. Some truths are too fleeting to cage in ink. The villagers searched for weeks, then months, their calls growing fainter as the seasons turned. Harthad alone kept vigil, his journals left deliberately blank, where the story mattered most. Yet sometimes, when the wind shifted just so, the oak's branches would dip as if in greeting, and the old scholar would smile, knowing what he could never prove, that the last elves had not so much vanished as stepped sideways into the spaces between breaths, where mortal eyes could follow only briefly, and only if they believed. In the years to come, travelers would speak of a glade where the stars seemed closer, and the air thrummed with half-heard singing. But by the time anyone thought to bring a loremaster, the path had grown over, leaving only the faintest impression in the grass, like the memory of a dream upon waking. The parchment crackled under Master Loremaster Calbaner's fingers, its surface, brittle as autumn leaves after centuries, hidden in the vaults of Austin Edhill. The script wasn't merely faded, it pulsed, the ink shifting like veins beneath his touch. For months, he'd labored in near darkness, piecing together fragments of what he'd believed was a historical account. But as the final glyphs aligned, his breath caught. This wasn't a chronicle, it was sheet music, the oldest known composition in existence. The very first song sung by the Elves at Cuiviénen, transcribed in a dialect so primal, even the High Elves had forgotten its cadence. Word spread through the guild halls like wind through reeds. Musicians, scholars, even blacksmiths, whose anvils had once rung with the rhythm of Noldoran forges, gathered at dusk in the ruined amphitheater where Calbaner stood, trembling. To hear it is to wake something, warned an elder minstrel, her harpstrings wrapped in silence. Some memories are buried for a reason, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. The first notes, coaxed from a lyre strung with silver, were tentative, a whisper of wind through distant trees. Then, as the chorus swelled, the air itself thickened. The stars overhead flared suddenly, their light piercing the gloom like unblinking eyes. Lirian, a minstrel whose voice had once charmed even the stones of Khazad Dûm, felt the melody coil around her ribs like a living thing. To sing it fully would be to give it breath, to invite the past to walk among them once more. But whose past? The joy of the firstborn awakening beneath the stars, or the grief of those who'd refused the call of the Valor, their voices still woven into the shadows of Middle-earth. Her fingers hovered above the strings. The choice wasn't between music and silence, but between remembrance and reckoning. Deep in the forests of Eriador, where no elf had walked for an age, the undergrowth shuddered. Roots twisted upward, forming arches too deliberate to be natural. A whisper, thin and resonant as a plucked wire, threaded through the branches, not an echo, but an answer. The song had been heard, and far to the east, in the ashes of Mordor, where even the crows dared not roost, a fissure split the obsidian plains, not wide enough for a hand, but enough for a whisper to slip through. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut by mortal hands. As the last note trembled into silence, the musicians stared at one another, their instruments humming with residual energy. The stars still burned too brightly, their patterns subtly altered, as if the sky had shifted to make room for something long absent. Lirian's lips parted, not in song, but in a question too vast for words. What had they summoned, and more crucially, would it forgive them for forgetting? The parchment in Calbaner's hands crumbled to dust, its work done, but the melody lingered, coiled in the marrow of those who'd heard it, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The final note hung in the air like a dewdrop on a spider's thread, fragile, trembling, then gone. For a breath, silence swallowed the amphitheater whole. Then the starlight pooled suddenly at the center of the stage, coalescing into a figure so radiant the musicians shielded their eyes. Her hair was not silver, but the pale gold of Laurelin's last fruit, her cloak woven from shadows and memory. Lirian's lyre slipped from numb fingers. None dared speak the name every heart recognized, one of the lost, those who had turned aside from the great journey. So long ago, the trees themselves had forgotten their footsteps. She did not step toward them so much as the world bent to meet her, the distance between breaths collapsing. "You sing of beginnings," she murmured, her voice the sound of leaves brushing in a wind that no longer blew. But we who remained became the ending. Her gaze traced their faces not with judgment, but a sorrow too vast for tears. The sea longing spared us, yet what is a heart but a cage for what it cannot have? A child's laugh echoed from the ruins, though no children stood among them. The elf's eyes closed. They took the light with them. We kept the silence. Kelbiner found his voice first, though it cracked like thin ice. Why reveal yourself now? The question seemed to amuse her, though her smile carried the weight of withered petals. You woke the song. Songs have consequences. Her fingers brushed the crumbled parchment, and where they touched, the ink flared once more. Not Quenya, not Sundering, but something older, wilder. The very script shivered, reshaping itself into a map of waterways long since swallowed by the earth. Not all who linger do so by choice. Some roads remain open, if one remembers the way. A gust scattered the parchment to dust before anyone could seize it. The elf was already fading, her edges blurring like mist at dawn. Tell them we are still here, she whispered, not to the crowd, but to the stones beneath their feet. When the world grows quiet enough, even shadows sing. Then she was simply absent, the space where she'd stood holding only the scent of rain on dry soil. The stars overhead dimmed to their ordinary brightness, leaving the musicians clutching instruments that would never feel quite theirs again. Lyrian lifted her lyre. The strings thrummed faintly, though her hands hadn't moved. Somewhere beyond the ruins, a nightingale trilled 3 perfect notes, then fell abruptly silent. The minstrel's breath caught. She knew, as they all did in that moment, that the song wasn't finished. It had only slipped between the cracks of the world, waiting to be heard by ears that still knew how to listen. Elrond's scrolls lie quiet again, their fragile pages whispering against the cedarwood box that cradles them. The scholar's fingers, still tingling from tracing those ancient runes, linger on the latch hesitant, as if closing the lid might sever some fragile thread to the past. Outside, dawn paints the eastern horizon in hues of peach and gold. A new day for a world that no longer remembers the weight of elven footsteps in its valleys. Yet in the taverns of Bree, where firelight dances on weathered beams, a bard strums a melody older than the bricks of the prancing pony. The tune has no name in the common tongue, but the old hobbit in the corner hums along, his voice cracking on notes that taste of starlight and forgotten springs. Some say the elves took their magic with them when they sailed, but the scholar knows better. It lingers in the way the willow branches sway without wind by the brandywine, in the sudden clarity of a thrush's call at twilight, echoes of a song that never truly ended, only softened. The maps men draw now amid the hidden glades where silver leaves once rustled. Yet on midsummer nights, children still dare each other to peek between the oaks, hoping to catch a glimpse of what their grandparents swore they saw, a flash of brightness too swift to be firefly or fairy. The scholar tucks the key to Elrond's archives into their pocket, its metal warm against their palm. They could spend a lifetime deciphering every faded glyph, chasing shadows across parchment. But knowledge, like starlight, is meant to be carried. Turning toward the window, they watch a sparrow alight on the sill, its beak stuffed with twigs for a nest. The work continues, even when the architects are gone, and so the tale persists not in grand chronicles or battles recounted by bards, but in the quiet things, the way a stew tastes sweeter when seasoned with wild thyme from Lothlorien's lost groves. the dream that wakes you gasping with a melody you've never heard but somehow know by heart. The elves shaped Middle-earth not just with rings and swords, but with the quiet art of leaving traces too subtle to erase. Their cities may lie in ruins, their harps silent, but press your ear to the bark of a malorn sapling in the Shire, and you'll hear it, the faint, unfading hum of a world that still remembers.